My stepdaughter encouraged my husband to film us. Later, I watched it with her. What began as a playful, seemingly innocent suggestion turned into a tangled web of manipulation and deception that I never saw coming. At first, I thought Samantha's idea was harmless, a light-hearted attempt to bring some spontaneity back into my marriage. But when she insisted we watch the video together, I realized there was more behind her actions than I could have imagined. Sitting next to her, watching something so personal, I felt trapped, as if she'd orchestrated the entire situation to exert control over me. That moment was just the beginning of a much darker, more dangerous game. How far will her manipulations go? And can I escape before it's too late? Subscribe now to hear the full, shocking story, and let me know where you're watching from. When my husband handed me the camera, I knew this wasn't just another night. It was something orchestrated. Greg's smile was warm, almost boyish, as he set the device in my hands. Just for fun, he'd said, but the weight of it felt heavier than the compact plastic frame. I glanced at him, his eyes twinkling with mischief, and then at Samantha lounging on the couch behind him, her legs tucked under her as she scrolled through her phone. She looked up briefly, smirking as if she knew something I didn't. I'd been married to Greg for 7 years. He was dependable, steady, the kind of man you could build a life with. And I had. We had a nice house in the suburbs, quiet evenings together, and predictable routines. But if I was being honest, that steadiness had begun to feel more like stagnation. Then there was Samantha, Greg's daughter from his first marriage. At 22, she was bold, beautiful, and unnervingly perceptive. She moved back home after finishing college, citing the need to save money, though I often wondered if there were other reasons. There was an ease in the way she manipulated situations, charming Greg with her wit and turning small inconveniences into victories for herself. She wielded her role as Daddy's little girl like a weapon, expertly exploiting Greg's soft spot for her. Our relationship, though cordial, was distant. She rarely called me anything but Karen, a formality that subtly reinforced that I was her father's second choice. And yet, there were moments, fleeting, uncomfortable ones, when I caught her watching me. Her gaze lingered a second too long, her lips twitching into a knowing grin, as if she could see right through me. This particular evening had started like so many others. Greg was grilling steaks in the backyard, while Samantha and I exchanged polite but strained conversation in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, her phone in hand, tapping idly as she spoke. "You and Dad should do something fun together," she said, her voice casual, though her eyes sparkled with mischief. "Spice things up." I laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, I don't know," she said with a shrug, but the way her gaze flicked to the camera sitting on the counter betrayed her intent. "You could film something, like couples do, for memories." I should have dismissed it as a passing comment, but something in her tone made me uneasy. Before I could respond, Greg walked in, his cheeks pink from the grill's heat, carrying a platter of perfectly charred steaks. "Dinner's ready," he announced, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. Later that night, after Samantha had retreated to her room, Greg brought out the camera. His excitement was endearing, and despite my reservations, I agreed. "It'll be fun," he insisted, his smile infectious. "We haven't done anything spontaneous in ages." As I held the camera, recording snippets of our evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that Samantha's suggestion had planted the seed for this moment. It felt too calculated, too perfectly timed. Still, I pushed the thought aside, focusing on Greg's laughter as he posed dramatically for the camera. turning our living room into his personal stage. But even as we laughed, I felt the weight of Samantha's lingering presence. She'd made herself scarce, but her earlier smirk echoed in my mind. The next morning, I found myself alone in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through my phone. Samantha joined me, her hair tousled from sleep, wearing one of Greg's old college sweaters. "Morning," she said, her tone syrupy sweet. "How'd the filming go?" I stiffened. "It was fine." Her lips curved into a sly smile. "Fine. Come on, Karen. You can do better than that. Did you watch it back?" I avoided her gaze, focusing on the swirl of cream in my coffee. "No, not yet." "You should," she said, leaning against the counter, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's always interesting to see yourself from another perspective." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. There was something unsettling about the way she said it, as though she already knew what I'd see. Before I could respond, Greg entered, his presence breaking the tension. Samantha gave me one last knowing look before retreating to her room. Over the next few days, Samantha's presence felt more pronounced. She hovered in the background of my conversations with Greg, her comments laced with subtle insinuations that only I seemed to catch. "You and Dad look so cute filming together," she'd say, her tone light but her eyes sharp, as if daring me to react. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she lingered in doorways, the way her laughter seemed just a touch too loud when Greg complimented me, the way she positioned herself between us during movie nights. It was as if she was testing the boundaries of her influence, and I was the unwitting subject of her game. One evening, as Greg worked late in his office, Samantha approached me in the living room. She held the camera in her hand, its screen lit up. "I found this on the counter," she said, her voice casual. "Thought you might want to see the footage." "I'm good," I said quickly, my pulse quickening. She smiled, her expression unreadable. "Suit yourself. But if it were me, I'd be curious. You can learn a lot about yourself from watching." With that, she set the camera down on the coffee table and walked away, leaving me alone with the glowing screen. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, the temptation gnawing at me. Against my better judgment, I picked it up and pressed play. The footage was innocent enough, Greg and I laughing, exchanging jokes, and sharing fleeting glances that reminded me of the early days of our relationship. But as the video played on, I became hyper-aware of Samantha's influence. Her voice echoed in my mind, her presence haunting the edges of the screen. When Greg joined me later that night, I didn't mention the video. Instead, I lay awake long after he fell asleep, my mind racing. Samantha's words and actions had woven themselves into my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated. Over the next week, Samantha's presence became more intrusive, though Greg seemed blissfully unaware. Her comments grew bolder, her gaze more piercing. I could feel her constantly testing me, pushing boundaries in a way that was subtle enough to evade Greg's notice, but deliberate enough to leave me on edge. She wielded her influence with surgical precision, embedding herself deeper into the dynamic of our household. One evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing the last of the dinner dishes, Samantha entered with the same air of feigned nonchalance she'd adopted since this all began. She leaned against the counter, watching me in silence for a moment before speaking. "You know," she said, her voice smooth, almost conspiratorial. "Dad really lit up that night with the camera. He seemed happy." I turned to face her, drying my hands on a dish towel. "What are you getting at, Samantha?" She shrugged, her smirk infuriatingly calm. Just that maybe you should do more things like that. Keep things exciting for him. You wouldn't want him to get bored, would you? The jab landed harder than I cared to admit. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them, as though she knew exactly where to hit. Greg and I are fine, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Of course you are, her grin widened, but a little extra effort never hurts, just saying. She left the kitchen before I could respond, her laughter echoing down the hall. I gripped the edge of the counter, anger bubbling beneath the surface. What was she playing at? Why was she so intent on inserting herself into our marriage? That night, Greg suggested another filming session. He brought it up casually over dinner, his tone light and enthusiastic. We had so much fun last time. Why not do it again? I hesitated, glancing at Samantha, who was poking at her salad with a fork but clearly listening. I don't know, Greg. It's not really my thing. Samantha looked up, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Oh, come on, Karen. Live a little. Dad's right. It was fun. You should do it. Greg laughed, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension in her words. See, even Samantha agrees. Let's make a night of it. Trapped between his earnestness and her manipulative smirk, I relented. Fine, I said, forcing a smile. But just this once? He wasn't. As we set up the camera later that evening, I felt the same unease I'd experienced the first time, only now it was magnified. Samantha lingered in the hallway, her silhouette visible through the slightly ajar door. I could feel her presence like a shadow, watching, waiting. Greg, blissfully unaware, was his usual jovial self, cracking jokes as he adjusted the lighting. You're a natural, Karen, he said, grinning at me. You should have been an actress. I forced a laugh, my gaze flickering toward the door. Maybe in another life. When the filming began, I tried to relax, to lose myself in the moment. But Samantha's presence loomed like a specter, her earlier words ringing in my ears. Even after Greg turned off the camera and declared the evening a success, the tension lingered, wrapping itself around me like a second skin. The following morning, Samantha cornered me in the living room, her eyes alight with mischief. She held the camera in her hands, its screen glowing. You really should watch this one, she said, her voice dripping with suggestion. I don't need to watch it, I said firmly, reaching for the camera. Give it to me. She pulled it back, her smirk widening. Relax, Karen, I'm just trying to help. Don't you want to see how good you looked? Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Samantha, this isn't funny. I shrugged. Who said I was joking? She countered, her tone light but her eyes sharp. I mean it, you and Dad. You looked amazing together, like a real couple. It was inspiring. There was something in her voice, something calculated, almost sinister, that made my stomach churn. I'm serious, Samantha. Give me the camera. She hesitated, her gaze boring into mine as though she were trying to unearth some hidden truth. Finally, she handed it over, her fingers brushing mine just long enough to make the gesture feel deliberate. Fine, she said, her tone airy. But you're missing out. As she walked away, I stared at the camera in my hands, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. I wanted to erase the footage, to rid myself of the creeping unease that had taken root. But instead, I tucked the camera into a drawer and walked away, determined not to let her get under my skin. Despite my efforts to ignore her, Samantha's behavior escalated. She became more brazen, her comments sharper, her presence more suffocating. It was as though she thrived on the tension, feeding off my discomfort like a predator toying with its prey. One evening, as I sat in the living room scrolling through my phone, Samantha plopped down beside me, far too close for comfort. "So," she began, her tone casual, "what did you think of the video?" I didn't look up. I haven't watched it. "Why not?" she pressed, leaning in slightly. "Aren't you curious?" "It's chilling." "No," I said curtly, my fingers tightening around my phone. "I'm not." She laughed softly, a sound that grated against my nerves. "You're so uptight, Karen. You should loosen up. It's just a video." "It's none of your business," I snapped, finally meeting her gaze. "This is between me and Greg." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened, a flicker of something dark and unreadable passing across her face. "Oh, Karen," she said, her voice low and mocking. "You really don't get it, do you?" "Get what?" I demanded, my pulse quickening. She leaned back, her smirk widening. "Nothing," she said breezily. "Forget I said anything." But I couldn't. Her words clung to me like a thorn, digging deeper with each passing day. The breaking point came a few days later. Samantha approached me with the same infuriating smirk, holding her phone instead of the camera this time. "I have an idea," she said, her tone deceptively cheerful. "I'm not interested," I said without looking up. "Come on, Karen," she coaxed, stepping closer. "It's just a little fun, you and me, like a girls' night." I frowned, finally meeting her gaze. "What are you talking about?" She grinned, holding up her phone. "We should watch the video together, bond a little." My stomach dropped. "Absolutely not." "Why not?" she challenged, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "It's not like there's anything to hide." "That's enough, Samantha," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "This has gone too far." She tilted her head, her grin unfaltering. "Relax, Karen. It's just a video. What are you so afraid of?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I left the room, I could feel her gaze on me, cold and unyielding. For days, Samantha's suggestion lingered in the back of my mind, like a splinter I couldn't dislodge. Her words replayed in a maddening loop. "It's just a video. What are you so afraid of?" No matter how much I tried to brush them off, they seeped into my thoughts, gnawing away at my resolve. Greg, as usual, remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing between his daughter and me. He'd leave for work early, return late, and collapse on the couch with an exhausted smile, oblivious to the tension that thickened every room Samantha and I occupied together. And Samantha? She thrived in his absence. Her words became sharper, her presence bolder, and her games more dangerous. One afternoon, while Greg was out of town for a conference, Samantha cornered me in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed, her smirk as infuriating as ever. "So," she said, her tone dripping with mock cheerfulness, "are you going to keep avoiding me, or can we talk like adults?" "I'm not avoiding you," I snapped, though we both knew it was a lie. "Good," she said, pushing off the counter and stepping closer. "Then let's settle this. You and me, tonight. We watch the video together. No big deal." I stared at her, incredulous. "Why do you even care about this so much, Samantha? What's your angle?" She tilted her head, her grin widening. "No angle. I just think it's important for us to connect. Don't you?" Her words sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't just pushing boundaries anymore. She was tearing them down. "I'm not doing this," I said firmly, brushing past her. But later that night, as I sat alone in the living room, the silence pressing down on me, her suggestion resurfaced. Part of me wanted to call Greg, to tell him everything. But what would I even say? That his daughter was toying with me? That she was manipulating our relationship? It sounded absurd, even to me. And yet, the camera beckoned. It sat in the drawer where I'd tucked it away days ago, its presence almost palpable. Samantha's words echoed in my mind, louder now. What are you so afraid of? Hi. Samantha found me in the living room, staring at the blank television screen, the camera in my lap. She didn't say a word as she walked over and sat beside me, so close her knee brushed against mine. You're ready, she said softly, almost triumphantly. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned on the camera and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, and there we were, Greg and me, laughing and teasing each other, captured in the soft glow of our living room lamps. At first it seemed harmless, even endearing, a glimpse of a couple rediscovering their spark. But as the footage played on, I became hyper-aware of Samantha sitting beside me, her gaze fixed not on the screen, but on me. You look beautiful, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I stiffened, my eyes glued to the screen. Don't. You. Don't what? She asked, her tone teasing, as though she didn't already know. The video continued, but I could barely focus. Samantha's presence was overwhelming, her proximity suffocating. I could feel her watching me, her breath warm against my skin. The air between us grew heavy, charged with an electricity I couldn't explain. When the footage ended, the screen faded to black, leaving us bathed in silence. I exhaled shakily, my fingers trembling as I fumbled to turn off the camera. There, I said, my voice unsteady. Satisfied. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and took the camera from my hands, her touch lingering. You and Dad, you have something special, she said softly, her eyes locking onto mine. I just wanted to see it for myself. Her words were laced with something I couldn't quite place, admiration maybe, or envy. But there was also a darkness there, a challenge, as if she were daring me to confront her. You're playing a dangerous game, Samantha, I said, my voice low and firm. Whatever you're trying to do, it ends now. She smirked, leaning back against the couch. Oh, Karen, she said, her tone mocking. You really think this is about me? What else would it be about? I demanded, my frustration boiling over. You've been pushing and prodding and manipulating, and for what? What do you want from me? Her smile faltered for a moment, replaced by something colder, sharper. Maybe I just want to see how far you'll go. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to respond. But before I could say anything, she stood and walked away, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of the living room. The next morning, I woke to find Greg sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open, his coffee steaming beside him. He looked up as I entered, his face lighting up with a smile. Good morning, he said cheerfully. You're up early? I forced a smile, pouring myself a cup of coffee. Couldn't sleep. He didn't seem to notice the tension in my voice. Samantha said you two had a nice night together, he said, sipping his coffee. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. She told you that? Yay, he said with a shrug. She said you watched the video together. She seemed happy about it. I stared at him, my mind racing. Samantha had twisted the situation, spinning it into something that would seem innocent to Greg. She was always one step ahead. always in control. That's not exactly how it went, I said carefully, but Greg didn't press for details. He simply nodded and returned to his laptop, oblivious to the turmoil churning inside me. You heard it here. Over the next few days, Samantha's behavior shifted. She became more subtle, her manipulations harder to detect. She'd make offhand comments in Greg's presence, carefully crafted to sound harmless but laced with hidden barbs. "Karen's really opened up lately," she'd say with a knowing smile. "It's nice to see her having fun." Greg would laugh, unaware of the subtext, while I sat silently, my jaw clenched. Samantha was weaving a web of deceit around us, and I was trapped in its sticky threads. The final straw came one evening when Greg was working late. Samantha and I were alone again, the tension between us thicker than ever. She cornered me in the kitchen, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous intensity. "You know," she said casually, "I've been thinking about that video, about how much we could learn from it." "I don't want to hear it," I snapped, turning away. "Don't you?" she pressed, stepping closer. "Don't you want to understand why things feel so strained between us?" Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What are you talking about?" She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You feel it too, don't you? This thing between us." I stepped back, my pulse racing. "You're delusional." "Am I?" she asked, her smirk returning. "Or are you just too afraid to admit it?" I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed past her and fled the room, her laughter echoing behind me. As I locked myself in the bedroom, my hands trembling, I realized I was no longer just battling Samantha's manipulations. I was battling the dark truths she was forcing me to confront. The days after that evening were unbearable. Samantha's words echoed in my mind, looping endlessly until I felt like a prisoner in my own thoughts. She had crossed a line, but what terrified me most was that I couldn't tell where her games ended and the truth began. Every glance she cast in my direction felt heavy with unspoken meaning, every smile laced with implication. Greg, as usual, remained blissfully unaware. He seemed invigorated by some newfound energy, throwing himself into work and home projects with a zeal I hadn't seen in years. He attributed it to the fun we'd been having, assuming the tension between Samantha and me was non-existent. If anything, he praised her for bringing us closer. "I know," Camilla said to me, but Samantha wasn't content to fade into the background. Her presence in the house grew louder, more insistent. She started offering to help me with tasks she'd never cared about before: cleaning, cooking, even reorganizing my closet. At first, I refused, but her persistence wore me down. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the bedroom, she appeared in the doorway, a bottle of wine in hand. "Thought you could use a drink," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "I'm fine," I replied, keeping my focus on the neatly folded shirts. She stepped inside anyway, placing the wine and 2 glasses on the nightstand. "Don't be like that, Karen. We should talk." "I don't want to talk," I said, my voice firmer now. "And I certainly don't want to drink with you." She laughed softly, her confidence unnerving. "Suit yourself." She poured herself a glass, leaning casually against the bedpost. "You know, I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately, about how happy he seems. It's nice, isn't it, seeing him like that?" I didn't answer, but she continued as though I had. "It's funny, though," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. "Happiness is such a fragile thing, isn't it? So easily disrupted." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I stood, my fists clenching, the laundry in my hands. "What do you want, Samantha? Just say it." She set the glass down, her smirk unfaltering. "I want you to admit it." "Admit what?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. "That you feel it too," she said, stepping closer. Her voice was low, almost seductive. "This thing between us. It's been there all along, Karen. You just don't want to face it." "You're insane," I snapped, shoving past her. "Stay away from me." "Ah." But as I fled the room, I couldn't shake the look in her eyes. A dangerous mix of triumph and satisfaction, as though she had won some unspoken battle. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with every interaction we'd had over the past weeks. I felt trapped, cornered in my own home. Confronting Greg felt like the logical solution, but every time I imagined the conversation, I froze. How could I explain Samantha's manipulations without sounding paranoid? Worse, what if he didn't believe me? The next morning, Samantha's behavior shifted yet again. She was quieter, almost subdued, but her presence loomed larger than ever. She didn't need to speak to make her intentions known. Her silence said everything. Every glance, every smirk, every calculated movement was a reminder of the power she held over me. Greg, oblivious as ever, suggested a family dinner that evening. "It's been a while since we've all sat down together," he said with a smile. "It'll be nice, don't you think?" I forced a nod, my stomach churning at the thought of spending the evening across the table from Samantha, but refusing would only raise questions I wasn't ready to answer. Dinner was a tense affair. Greg chatted happily, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension between Samantha and me. She was quiet, her smile demure, but her eyes betrayed her. Every time our gazes met, I felt her unspoken challenge. "Say something. I dare you." I excused myself halfway through the meal, retreating to the bathroom to collect my thoughts. As I splashed cold water on my face, I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and there she was, her smile as infuriating as ever. "What are you doing, Samantha?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" She leaned against the doorframe, her expression calm. "Doing what?" "Don't play dumb," I snapped. "You've been pushing and pushing, trying to make me... I don't even know what you're trying to make me do." She shrugged, her gaze steady. Maybe I just want you to see the truth." "What truth?" I asked, my voice trembling. "That you're a manipulative little..." "Careful," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "You wouldn't want Greg to hear you." Her words stopped me cold. She was right. Raising my voice would only draw his attention, and she knew it. She thrived on the imbalance of power, using it to her advantage at every turn. "I don't know what game you're playing," I said through gritted teeth, "but it ends now." She smirked, stepping closer. "Oh, Karen, this isn't a game. It's just reality. You can't run from it forever." I pushed past her, my heart pounding in my chest. When I returned to the table, Greg was none the wiser, his attention focused on recounting a story from work. Samantha took her seat across from me, her smile infuriatingly smug. The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety and dread. Samantha's behavior remained unsettlingly subdued, but I knew better than to trust the calm. She was waiting, biding her time, and I was walking on eggshells, unsure of when or how she would strike next. It finally came to a head one evening when Greg was working late. I was sitting in the living room, the television playing quietly in the background, when Samantha appeared. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me in silence before stepping inside. "We need to talk," she said, her tone devoid of the mockery I'd come to expect. "I don't want to hear it," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever it is, just keep it to yourself." She ignored me, sitting down on the couch beside me. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she began, her voice unnervingly calm. "About this thing between us." "There is no thing, Samantha," I snapped, standing. "This ends now, do you hear me?" She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "You keep saying that, Karen, but we both know it's not true." I turned to leave, but her next words stopped me in my tracks. "If you don't want to face it, that's fine, but Greg deserves to know." My blood ran cold. I turned to face her, my voice shaking with anger. "What are you talking about?" She shrugged, her smirk returning. "I'm just saying, maybe he should hear the truth about everything." Her threat was clear, and it left me reeling. Samantha had backed me into a corner, and I had no idea how to fight my way out. I spent the next day in a haze of paranoia, my mind spinning with Samantha's veiled threat. Her words had wrapped around me like a vice, squeezing out every ounce of resolve I had left. Every sound in the house felt amplified, her footsteps down the hall, the distant hum of her laughter, and every glance she threw my way was laced with unspoken menace. Greg's obliviousness felt like a betrayal in itself. How could he not see what was happening? Or worse, did he see it and choose to ignore it? Through everything, that next journey, as the writer likes to say. That evening, as I set the table for dinner, Samantha walked into the kitchen, her movements unnervingly casual. "Smells good," she said, her tone cheerful, as if the conversation from the night before hadn't happened. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," I said stiffly, keeping my back to her. "Just a regular dinner." She laughed softly. "You're tense, Karen. Relax." "I'm fine," I snapped, slamming a plate down on the table a little harder than I intended. "You don't seem fine," she countered, stepping closer. "But don't worry, I can help with that." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't respond. I couldn't give her the satisfaction of knowing she'd rattled me. Instead, I turned to leave the room, brushing past her as I went. But as I did, she grabbed my arm, her grip firm. "Karen," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "you can't keep running from this." I wrenched my arm free, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Stay away from me," I hissed, my voice trembling with anger. Her smile didn't waver. If anything, it widened, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "As you wish." Dinner that night was a strange affair. Greg, as usual, dominated the conversation with stories from work, blissfully unaware of the tension simmering between Samantha and me. She played her role perfectly, laughing at his jokes and chiming in with anecdotes of her own, all while casting me sly, knowing glances across the table. By the time the meal ended, I felt like I was going to explode. As Greg cleared the plates, Samantha leaned across the table toward me, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't avoid this forever, Karen. Sooner or later, you're going to have to face it." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I excused myself and retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I sank onto the edge of the bed, my mind racing. How had it come to this? How had I allowed her to gain so much power over me? Later that night, I heard the sound of the front door closing, followed by Greg's car starting in the driveway. He'd mentioned running a quick errand, but his absence filled me with dread. Samantha was still in the house, and I could feel her presence, even before she knocked on the bedroom door. "Karen?" she called softly, her voice muffled through the wood. "Open the door. We need to talk." I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door, willing her to go away. But she didn't. The doorknob rattled, and then, to my horror, the lock clicked open. She stepped inside, her expression calm but her eyes alight with that same unnerving intensity. "You can't hide from me, Heron." "How did you—" I began, but she held up a small metal tool, spinning it between her fingers. "Lockpicking," she said with a smirk. "One of the many skills Dad doesn't know I have." I stood, my body trembling with equal parts fear and rage. "Get out of my room." She ignored me, stepping closer. "You know, I've been thinking," she said, her tone light. "Maybe you're not the problem here. Maybe it's me." Her words caught me off guard. "What are you talking about?" She sighed, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "I've always been a little intense," she admitted, her voice softening. "It's not easy, you know, watching Dad with someone else, knowing I'll never measure up." Her sudden vulnerability threw me. For a moment I almost believed her, but then her gaze locked onto mine, sharp and calculating. "But then again," she continued, her tone shifting, "maybe I don't need to measure up. Maybe I just need to make sure he sees me differently." "What are you saying?" I demanded, my voice trembling. She stood, her smile returning. "I'm saying you should be careful, Karen. Things have a way of shifting when you least expect it." The next morning, Greg noticed the strain in my voice, the way my hands trembled as I poured my coffee. "Are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to spill every detail of Samantha's manipulations, to beg him to see the truth. But when I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. She had planted a seed of doubt in me, a fear that he wouldn't believe me, or worse, that he already knew and chose to turn a blind eye. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just didn't sleep well." That evening, Samantha delivered her final blow. I found her in the living room, watching something on the TV. As I approached, I realized with horror what it was. The video. Our video. "How dare you," I began, but she held up a hand, cutting me off. "Relax," she said, her voice calm. "It's just us girls. No harm, no foul." My vision blurred with rage. "Turn it off, now." She complied, but her smirk didn't falter. "You're so predictable, Karen, always so desperate to protect your image." "You've crossed the line," I hissed. "This ends now." She stood, stepping closer until we were inches apart. "You don't get it, do you? This doesn't end until I say it does." I wanted to scream, to strike her, to do anything to wipe that smug expression off her face. But I couldn't. She had me cornered, and she knew it. That night, I made a decision. As Greg slept soundly beside me, I crept out of bed and into the living room, where the camera still sat on the coffee table. I deleted the video, every trace of it, and then smashed the camera to pieces. It was a small victory, but it gave me a sliver of control in a situation where I had none. Samantha didn't react when she discovered what I'd done. If anything, she seemed amused, as though I'd played right into her hands. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity. Her games weren't about me. They were about power, and I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of breaking me. The story ends on a chilling note, with Samantha's smirk a constant presence in my mind. She hadn't won, but neither had I. Our uneasy truce was a ticking time bomb, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she made her next move. And Greg? He remained blissfully unaware, his smile as steady as ever. But every time he looked at me, I couldn't help but wonder, how much did he really see? Samantha leaned back on the couch, her legs crossed and a sly smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. I was seated beside her, the tension in my chest almost suffocating. The video played on the screen before us, a montage of stolen moments between Greg and me, our whispered laughter and soft exchanges. Watching it was surreal, like peering into someone else's life, yet the vulnerability I felt was entirely my own. You know, Samantha finally broke the silence, her voice lilting with feigned innocence. Dad adores you. He says you've brought life back into this house. I swallowed hard, unsure of where she was going with this. That's kind of him to say, I murmured, avoiding her piercing gaze. She tilted her head, studying me. It's just interesting, isn't it? How fragile trust can be. My stomach churned. What do you mean? Samantha reached for the remote and paused the video at a seemingly innocuous moment. A brief glance Greg had stolen at me across the dinner table, his eyes brimming with affection. To anyone else, it would have been a touching display of marital love. To Samantha, it was evidence. Her eyes flicked back to me, sharp and calculating. Do you think he trusts you completely? The room felt colder suddenly. Of course he does. Why wouldn't he? She chuckled softly, the sound dripping with mockery. Oh, Karen, you're good at this, I'll give you that. But you're not perfect. What are you talking about, Samantha? I demanded, my voice wavering between irritation and fear. Her smile widened. Relax. I'm not here to ruin your life. At least, not yet. In the days that followed, Samantha's behavior shifted. She wasn't overtly hostile or confrontational, but there was a new edge to her presence, a silent but palpable reminder that she held the upper hand. She knew something, or she thought she did. I found myself tiptoeing around her, my every word and action carefully measured. Greg, oblivious as ever, noticed none of the undercurrents between us. He was busy with work and, as usual, relied on me to manage the household dynamics. One afternoon, while Greg was out, Samantha cornered me in the kitchen. She was holding a glass of wine, her posture relaxed but her eyes gleaming with mischief. You're probably wondering what I want, she began casually. Not really, I replied, focusing on chopping vegetables. I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing. Her laughter was sharp. Oh, Karen, you're smarter than that. You know I have leverage. The question is, what am I going to do with it? I stopped chopping and turned to face her, knife still in hand. Spit it out, Samantha. What do you want? She took a slow sip of her wine, savoring the moment. I want to make a deal. You give me what I want, and I'll make sure Greg never sees that video. My heart stopped. What video? She raised an eyebrow. The one on your phone. The one you accidentally backed up to the cloud Greg and I share. Her words hit me like a freight train. I had been careless, trusting that the cloud storage was secure and private. My mind raced, trying to recall every photo, every video, every message I had saved. Could she be bluffing? Or did she really have access to something incriminating? I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Samantha smiled knowingly. Oh, but you do. And you know Greg won't be as understanding as you hope, so here's my proposition. You convince Dad to co-sign on my business loan and I delete the file, no questions asked. You're blackmailing me, I said, incredulous. Such a harsh word, she replied. Think of it as insurance. I clenched my fists, the weight of her threat pressing down on me. Samantha wasn't bluffing. She had the evidence, and she was willing to use it. But her demand was outrageous. I couldn't let her manipulate Greg like this. Yet I couldn't risk her following through on her threat either. I'll think about it, I said finally, hoping to buy time. Samantha set her glass down and leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. You don't have long, Karen. Tick-tock. That night, I barely slept. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and strategy. If Samantha was willing to go this far, what else was she capable of? I needed a plan, a way to outsmart her without letting Greg become collateral damage. She'd left several messages documenting her even more bloody interactions and plans for the future. The answer came to me in the early hours of the morning, a spark of inspiration born from desperation. Samantha wasn't the only one who could play dirty. Over the next few days, I began gathering my own evidence. Subtly and carefully, I started documenting Samantha's behavior, the way she manipulated Greg, her lavish spending habits, the questionable business ventures she was so desperate to fund. I combed through social media, looking for any posts or comments that could discredit her. And then I found it. A series of photos from a wild party she had attended just weeks earlier. They weren't overtly scandalous, but they painted a picture of someone far removed from the responsible entrepreneur she pretended to be. I printed the photos and tucked them into an envelope, along with a note. Leverage works both ways. The next time Samantha cornered me, I handed her the envelope. Her confident smirk faltered as she flipped through the photos, her eyes narrowing. What is this? She demanded. Insurance, I said, echoing her own words. You want to play games, Samantha? Fine. But don't forget, I can play too. She glared at me, her jaw tightening. You think this will stop me? I think it'll make you think twice, I replied, because if you go after me, I'll make sure Greg sees these, and then we'll see who he trusts. I added. For a long moment, we stared each other down, the tension crackling like static electricity. Finally, Samantha let out a bitter laugh and tossed the envelope onto the counter. Fine, she said, you win this round, but don't think this is over. She stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me shaken, but victorious. For now, at least, the threat had been neutralized. But I knew Samantha well enough to know she wasn't done scheming. As I stood there, my heart still racing, I realized something. I had underestimated her, and she had underestimated me. The video played on the screen in front of Greg, Samantha, and me. I sat frozen on the couch, my stomach twisting into knots. Samantha had finally dropped her facade. She had been biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to spring her trap. And now, here we were, my carefully constructed life unraveling in mere seconds. Greg's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, his eyes darting between the screen and me. Karen, what is this? He asked, his voice tight with anger. It's not what it looks like, I stammered, but even I didn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. Samantha smirked, perched on the arm of the chair across from us. "Oh, come on, Karen," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Let's not insult Dad's intelligence. It's exactly what it looks like." Greg hit pause, silencing the damning footage. "Explain," he demanded, his face ashen. "Right now." I opened my mouth to respond, but Samantha cut in before I could utter a word. "You see, Dad, I found this video purely by accident. Imagine my surprise when I realized Karen had been recording private little moments between the two of you. Except," she tilted her head, feigning innocence, "they weren't just about the two of you, were they?" "Samantha, stop," I snapped, my voice trembling. "Oh no, Karen, you wanted to play games. Now we're playing." Her tone sharpened, her mask of civility slipping away. "Dad deserves the truth." Greg's eyes burned into me, searching for answers. "Karen, was this meant for me? Or is there something else I need to know?" The room was thick with tension, and Samantha reveled in it. She crossed her arms, her smug satisfaction evident. "Oh, Dad, don't make her lie to you again. That video wasn't just for you. She's been hiding things. Big things." "Samantha, enough," I shouted, standing up. "This is between Greg and me." "Not anymore," she replied coldly. She turned to Greg. "Do you know why Karen's been so stressed lately? Why she's always tiptoeing around the house? It's because she's been covering her tracks. She didn't want you to see this." With a flourish, Samantha grabbed a remote from the table and clicked a button. Another video began to play, one I didn't even know existed. The footage showed me in the backyard with our neighbor Michael. It wasn't incriminating at first, two adults talking, laughing. But then, the camera zoomed in, capturing the moment Michael brushed a strand of hair from my face and let his hand linger. "Stop it," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Oh, it gets better," Samantha said, her eyes gleaming with malice. She fast-forwarded to the part where Michael leaned in, his lips barely grazing my cheek. It wasn't an affair, but it was enough to plant seeds of doubt. Greg's face hardened. "Karen, what the hell is this?" he asked, his voice breaking. I felt the walls closing in around me. "Greg, it's not what it looks like," I said, tears pooling in my eyes. "I swear." "Nothing happened." "Nothing happened?" Samantha echoed, feigning shock. "Then why did Karen delete this video from her phone the second she saw me looking at it?" I turned to Greg, desperate to salvage what was left of our relationship. "She's lying, Greg. She's manipulating you. She's been trying to drive a wedge between us from the start." Greg looked at Samantha, then back at me. "Did you delete the video?" he asked quietly. I hesitated, and that hesitation was all Samantha needed to solidify her victory. "See," Samantha said triumphantly, "she can't even admit it. She's been hiding things, Dad. How can you trust someone like that?" "I didn't want you to see it because I knew it would hurt you," I admitted finally, my voice trembling. "But I swear, Greg, nothing happened between Michael and me. I would never do that to you." Greg sank into the couch, his head in his hands. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he muttered. Samantha leaned in, her victory within reach. "Dad, you deserve better than this. Karen's been lying to you, hiding things. She's not the person you think she is." But just as she reached for the remote to play another clip, Greg snapped. "Enough!" he roared, his voice echoing through the room. He stood up, towering over Samantha, his face red with anger. "This isn't your place, Samantha. You don't get to dictate what happens in my marriage." Samantha faltered, her confidence shaken. "I'm just trying to protect you," she said, her voice softening. No, you're trying to control me, Greg shot back. You've been doing it for years, using guilt, manipulation, whatever you can to get your way. Well, not anymore. Samantha's face twisted with rage. You're seriously going to take her side after everything I've shown you? After everything she's done? Greg turned to me, his eyes filled with pain. Karen, I need the truth. All of it. Right now. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking. Greg, I didn't have an affair. Michael and we had a moment of weakness, but it didn't go any further. I should have told you, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing you, of what it would do to us. Utterly afraid. Greg's expression was unreadable, his silence deafening. Finally, he nodded. I need time to process this, he said, his voice hollow. And what about her? Samantha interjected, her anger flaring again. She's lying, Dad. She's trying to manipulate you, just like she manipulated Michael. No, Samantha, Greg said firmly. The only person manipulating anyone here is you. Samantha recoiled as if she'd been slapped. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice trembling with frustration. No, the mistake was letting you turn this family into a battleground, Greg replied. If you can't accept Karen as part of this family, then maybe it's time for you to move out. The room fell silent, the weight of Greg's words hanging in the air. Samantha's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away, her pride preventing her from breaking down in front of us. Honestly, fine, she said coldly, but don't come crying to me when she breaks your heart. With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving Greg and me alone. The silence was deafening, but it was also a small relief, an opportunity to begin repairing the damage. Ring, my sister. I'm sorry, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For everything. Greg looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and resolve. We'll get through this, he said, but it's going to take time. I nodded, knowing that trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to move forward, together. The house was eerily quiet after Samantha stormed out, her presence lingering like a storm that had passed but left destruction in its wake. Greg sat across from me in the living room, his elbows on his knees, his hands rubbing his temples. He looked exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. I wanted to reach out, to say something that would fix this, but I knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything hung heavy in the air between us. Finally, Greg broke the silence. I don't know where to start, he admitted, his voice low and strained. I don't even know what to think right now. I swallowed hard. I'll answer anything you want to know, I said softly. But first, I need you to understand. I never stopped loving you, Greg. Never. He looked up at me, his eyes clouded with a mix of emotions. Hurt, anger, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite place. Then why, Karen? Why did you let it get this far? Why didn't you just come to me? I took a deep breath, feeling the sting of tears that threatened to spill. Because I was scared, I said, my voice trembling. Scared of losing you, scared of what you'd think of me, scared that even if nothing really happened with Michael, it was enough to break us. Greg leaned back, his shoulders slumping. Do you even realize how much damage this has done? Not just to us, but to the trust we built? I thought we had something unshakable. We do, I said quickly. Or at least we did. And I want to get that back, Greg. I'll do whatever it takes. Greg let out a long sigh, his eyes fixed on the coffee table as if it held the answers he was searching for. This isn't something that can be fixed overnight, Karen. You know that, right? I know, I said, nodding, and I don't expect it to be, but I'm willing to put in the work. I need you to believe that. He looked at me again, his expression softening just a fraction. Then start by telling me everything. No more secrets, no more half-truths. If we're going to move forward, I need to know I can trust you again. So I told him. I told him about the conversation with Michael, how it started innocently but became something more complicated. I told him about Samantha's threats, how she had cornered me with her manipulations and how I had let my fear get the better of me. By the time I finished, Greg looked both devastated and weary, but there was also a hint of understanding in his eyes. Samantha, he said bitterly, shaking his head. She's always been manipulative, but this is a new low. She wanted control, I said, and for a while I let her have it. But I realize now that was a mistake. I should have come to you the moment she started threatening me. Greg nodded slowly. Yeah, you should have. But I can see why you didn't. Samantha knows how to get under people's skin. She knows how to make you doubt yourself. What are we going to do about her? I asked hesitantly. That's something I'll handle, he said firmly. She's my daughter, and I'll always love her. But this isn't something I can let slide. She needs to understand there are consequences to her actions. The next morning, Greg called Samantha and asked her to come over. She arrived reluctantly, her arms crossed and her expression defiant. I stayed in the kitchen, giving Greg space to talk to her alone. Their voices carried through the house, low at first, but gradually rising as the conversation became more heated. How could you do this, Sam? Irene demanded. To me? To Karen? What were you thinking? I was thinking about you, Samantha shot back. About protecting you from someone who clearly doesn't deserve you? That's not your decision to make, Greg said sharply. You don't get to play God with my marriage, Sam. And the way you went about it, blackmail, manipulation, that's not protecting anyone. That's just cruel. You're really going to take her side? Samantha said, her voice cracking. After everything I've done for you? This isn't about sides, Greg said. It's about what's right and what's wrong. And what you did was wrong. If you can't see that, then maybe it's time for you to move out and figure out what kind of person you want to be. There was a long pause, and then I heard Samantha's footsteps storming toward the door. She left without saying another word, slamming the door behind her. Greg walked into the kitchen, his face etched with sadness. She'll come around, he said, more to himself than to me. I just hope it's sooner rather than later. The days that followed were a delicate dance between rebuilding and healing. Greg and I began going to couples therapy, a suggestion I had made in desperation, but one that Greg agreed to with surprising willingness. In those sessions, we unpacked years of suppressed emotions, unspoken frustrations, and the cracks in our foundation that had allowed everything to spiral out of control. At home, we started taking small steps toward reconnecting. Shared dinners became moments of tentative laughter. Quiet evenings on the couch turned into opportunities to talk, really talk, about our fears, our dreams, and what we wanted for our future. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of what had happened threatened to pull us under. But we kept pushing forward, one step at a time. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Greg reached for my hand. It was the first time in weeks he had initiated any physical contact, and the gesture brought tears to my eyes. "I'm still angry," he admitted, his voice soft, "and I don't know when or if that anger will completely go away. But I do know this. I want to try. I want us to work." I squeezed his hand, my heart swelling with hope. "I do too," I said, my voice breaking. "More than anything." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Our journey was far from over, and the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, I believed we could make it, together. The house felt emptier than it ever had. Samantha's room was stripped of everything that made it hers, leaving behind the faintest traces of her presence: a forgotten book, a stray earring glinting on the windowsill. Greg and I stood in the doorway, neither of us speaking, lost in the weight of what her absence meant. "She'll be okay," Greg finally said, his voice uncertain despite the attempt at conviction. "I hope so," I replied, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. Her departure had been abrupt and laden with tension. She hadn't looked back as she drove away, leaving us to pick up the pieces of what felt like a fractured family. Greg had tried to reach her, to soften the edges of their strained relationship, but Samantha's pride was a barrier too high to breach. Her final words, laced with defiance, still echoed in my mind, a reminder of how far we had all been pushed. Greg rubbed his hands over his face, his weariness showing in the deep lines around his eyes. "She'll figure it out," he said, as if trying to convince himself. "She just needs time." I nodded, though guilt gnawed at me. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was partly responsible for the distance between them. My mistakes, my silence, and the chaos that followed had created rifts I wasn't sure we could mend. And while Greg insisted we were finding a way forward, the shadows of everything that had happened lingered. Later that evening, I found myself in Samantha's room again, drawn to its stillness. The air was heavy with memories, and I ran my fingers over her desk, where a faint coffee ring marked the surface. It was strange to feel a pang of loss for someone who had caused so much pain. But the ache was there, stubborn and unshakable. On the desk, tucked beneath a paperweight, was a folded piece of paper. My breath caught as I picked it up, my hands trembling. "Dad and Karen, I don't know if you'll ever fully understand why I did what I did, or if I'll ever be able to explain it in a way that makes sense. I wanted to protect you, Dad. I've seen what happens when trust is broken, and I didn't want that for you. But I see now that I went about it all wrong. I can't promise I'll change overnight, and I can't promise that things will ever go back to the way they were. But I can promise this: I'll think about everything you said. Maybe one day we can try again. Take care of each other, Samantha." Tears blurred my vision as I read her words. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was something, a step. She hadn't slammed the door shut completely. There was still a sliver of hope, however faint, that we could rebuild. I brought the note to Greg and watched his expression as he read it. His face was unreadable at first, but when he looked up, his eyes held a glimmer of something softer. "She'll come back," he said quietly. "I know she will." We spent the rest of the evening together in the living room, sitting in a silence that felt less like avoidance and more like peace. The television played in the background, but neither of us paid attention. There were still wounds to heal, still difficult conversations to be had, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like the storm had passed. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen as sunlight poured through the windows. As I stood at the counter sipping from my mug, I realized how much had changed. The Karen I had been weeks ago, fearful, hiding from the truth, felt like a stranger now. I wasn't proud of my actions, but I had faced them, and in doing so, I had taken the first steps toward healing. Greg joined me a few minutes later, his hair tousled from sleep. He poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, watching me. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so," I said. "Are you?" He smiled faintly, getting there. We sipped our coffee in quiet companionship, the weight of everything lifting slightly with each passing moment. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing had happened. Inside, though, there was a fragile sense of resolution. We had been through so much, and there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, it felt like we might actually be able to walk it together. Greg raised his mug slightly. "Here's to starting over." "To starting over," I echoed, clinking my mug against his. As we stood there in the golden light of morning, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't certainty or relief, but hope. And that was enough.